small village of Haverford had its fair share of ghost stories, but none were as chilling as the legend of the old woman in the window. The tale was whispered among the villagers, a warning to those who dared to stay out too late or venture too close to the abandoned cottage on the edge of the woods. The cottage had once belonged to Agnes Miller, a reclusive woman who was rumoured to be a witch. She lived alone, shunned by the villagers who feared her strange ways and dark mutterings. When she died, her body was discovered weeks later, still sitting in her favourite chair by the window, staring out with unseeing eyes. Since then, her ghost was said to haunt the cottage, waiting for someone to release her from her torment. For years no one dared to go near the cottage, but that changed when Thomas and Sarah Walker moved to the village. They were newlyweds, seeking a quiet place to start their life together. The old cottage, with its cheap price and secluded location, seemed perfect. The villagers warned them of the old woman's ghost, but they dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense. On the day they moved in, Sarah found herself drawn to the window where Agnes had died. It was a large bay window that looked out over the dark, dense woods. As she cleaned away the dust and cobwebs, she felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced outside and thought she saw a shadow move among the trees. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as her imagination. That night, as they settled into their new home, a storm rolled in. The wind howled around the cottage, rattling the windows and shaking the old creaky walls. Thomas and Sarah huddled together in front of the fireplace, trying to ignore the eerie sounds. Just as they were starting to relax, they heard a loud thump from upstairs. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and headed up to investigate, with Sarah close behind. The noise had come from the room with the bay window. As they entered, the air grew cold, and they saw that the window had been thrown open. Rain and wind poured into the room, and the once clean floor was now soaked and covered in muddy footprints. Thomas closed the window and locked it, assuring Sarah that it must have been the wind. They mopped up the mess and returned to the living room, but the unease lingered. That night, Sarah dreamt of the old woman. She saw her standing at the window, staring out into the darkness, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Objects would move on their own, doors would creak open and shut, and Sarah always felt like she was being watched. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, she glanced out the window and saw the old woman standing among the trees, her pale face glowing in the fading light. Sarah screamed, dropping the knife she was holding. Thomas ran in, but by the time he looked out the window, the old woman was gone. He tried to comfort Sarah, but she was shaken to her core. That night, she insisted that they sleep in the same room as the bay window, hoping to confront whatever was haunting them. As they lay in bed, the wind howled outside, and the house creaked and groaned. Sarah kept her eyes on the window, determined not to let the old woman scare her. Just as she was starting to drift off, she saw a shadow move outside. She nudged Thomas awake, and they both watched as the shadow grew larger and more distinct. The old woman appeared, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes fixed on Sarah. She raised a bony hand and pointed directly at her. Sarah felt a cold dread wash over her as the old woman's mouth moved, silently forming words that she couldn't hear. "She wants something," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded, his face pale. "We need to find out what it is." The next day they searched the cottage for any clues about Agnes Miller and what she might want. In the attic they found an old trunk filled with letters, photographs, and a dusty, leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Agnes, and as Sarah read through it, she began to understand the old woman's torment. Agnes had indeed been a witch, but she had used her powers to protect the village. She had been wrongfully accused of cursing a child who had died of illness, and the villagers had turned on her, isolating her in her final years. Her spirit was restless, seeking justice and acknowledgement for the good she had done. That night, Sarah and Thomas decided to perform a ritual to set Agnes's spirit free. They gathered the necessary items from the journal, her favourite shawl, a silver locket, and a candle, and set up a small altar in front of the bay window. As they lit the candle and began the incantation, the air grew cold and the room darkened. The old woman appeared at the window, her face filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Sarah continued the incantation, her voice strong and clear. The candle flickered, and a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the flame. For a moment everything was silent. Then the old woman smiled, her face softening. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," before slowly fading away. The air grew warm, and the oppressive feeling that had filled the cottage lifted. Sarah and Thomas knew that Agnes had finally found peace. They sealed the bay window and placed the journal and letters back in the trunk, keeping it as a reminder of the old woman's story. From that day on, the strange occurrences stopped. The cottage felt warm and inviting, and Sarah and Thomas could finally enjoy their new home. The villagers noticed the change as well, and the legend of the old woman in the window became a tale of redemption rather than fear. Sarah often thought about Agnes and the sacrifice she had made for the village. She was grateful to have played a part in giving the old woman the peace she deserved. And every now and then she would sit by the bay window, looking out into the woods, feeling a sense of connection to the past and the spirits that lingered there. The story of the old woman in the window became a symbol of forgiveness and the power of acknowledging the truth, no matter how dark it might be. And in the quiet village of Haverford, the memory of Agnes Miller lived on, no longer as a ghostly figure to be feared, but as a protector and a reminder of the importance of justice and understanding.